In the quiet hours when the world is supposed to sleep, there are stories that slip between the cracks, whispers traded in message boards, fragments buried in forgotten archives, strange tales that don't behave like fiction and refuse to die like myths. They surface under a dozen names, but the ones who chase them call them the Whishdom stories, folk parables that feel older than the paper they're written on, yet mutate like something alive inside the network. They appear suddenly, without origin, recited by strangers who swear they've heard them since childhood, though no trace exists in books, no record in libraries, no parent recalls ever telling them. Each account is familiar but bent, as if the story was designed to unsettle, to haunt the teller more than the listener. And behind every retelling, there is always the same silence, the same missing thread, the same heavy implication that something isn't being said. These are not just stories. They are signals. And once you've heard one, it waits in your head, rewiring what you believe about memory, folklore, and the thin membrane that separates invention from intrusion. Underneath the surface of ordinary nights, there are fractures, small, untraceable disruptions that no one can explain but everyone feels. A shadow in the corner of the mind. A flicker in memory, where something should be, but isn't. Witnesses describe it in whispers, like déjà vu turned violent, like the sudden sense that you are living inside someone else's recollection. I know this story, they insist, though no record proves it was ever told. You try to trace its origin, scrolling through archives, combing through folklore indexes, only to find pages missing, citations redacted, timelines broken by edits that never should have happened. A file is opened. The record shows access, but no author. Threads vanish mid-sentence, leaving only the echoes of someone asking, "Did you see it too?" Time itself bends strangely around these stories. Reports surface in clusters, years apart but identical in detail. 1973, 1989, 2006, 2021. Each account delivered in the same language, as though the words themselves were scripted long before the witness was even born. Children recite lines their parents swear they never taught them. Whole families wake from identical dreams, each describing a place none of them have ever seen. Then there is the silence, the way entire communities refuse to acknowledge the tale once it surfaces. Like a wound sealed too quickly, it festers, unspoken but alive, until the next outbreak. Every date feels less like history and more like the pulse of something watching, timing itself, syncing with us. There are fragments, half buried in digital ruins. A username posting the same phrase across forums in 2009, "We were warned, but not by who you think." A scanned page on archive.org that once carried the phrase, "Whishdom cycle," before it was abruptly removed. A redacted line from a FOIA request, black ink blotting out every word but two, oral tradition. And always, the insistence that these tales were never supposed to be stories. They were warnings, encoded, scattered, repeated until we mistook them for folklore. If you read too closely, if you follow the rhythm long enough, it stops sounding like a tale at all. It sounds like instruction. And maybe that's why the endings never feel complete. They don't resolve. They don't teach. They linger, like a door left half open in a house you swore was locked. Some researchers say this is by design, that the Whishdom stories were engineered to leave the mind unfinished, forcing the listener to supply their own terror, their own ending, their own paranoia. But others whisper of something darker. That each telling, each repetition, isn't just an act of remembrance. It's an act of summoning. That by speaking the words aloud, by letting them pass from one mouth to another, you're not just keeping the story alive. You're feeding what waits inside it. They arrive like whispers in the dark, slipping between conversations and half-remembered dreams, carried on voices that swear they've always been there, though no one can name the first time they were told. People on old forums still describe it the same way. "I've heard this since I was a kid, but my parents swear they never told it." The words feel older than the speaker, older than the house they grew up in, yet no trace exists in books, no entry in folklore records, no citation in any library. The stories surface in playground chants, in campfire retellings, in the anonymous confessions of strangers online, always familiar, always intimate, but somehow impossible to prove. And when you finally try to pin them down, Who told you first, what year, what house, what night? You realize there is no answer. Only the echo of a story that shouldn't exist, but somehow already does. Folklorists call these synthetic traditions, tales without origin, myths without mothers. But even they admit the phenomenon doesn't behave like folklore. Folk tales evolve slowly, twisted by culture and language, shaped by geography. A wishdom story appears fully formed, almost like an intrusion, and spreads silently without mutation. In darker circles, researchers stop using academic language altogether. They reach for stranger concepts, egregores, thought forms given life by belief. Tulpas, creations of will that become autonomous. The danger lies not in hearing them once, but in repeating them. Because the more a story is told, the more it hardens, the more it takes shape, not just in the memory of a single person, but in the gaps between every person who carries it. There are unsettling patterns. Witnesses, separated by decades, describe identical lines recited in the exact same cadence. A child in 1973 whispers a rhyme that a stranger in 2006 will later recall, word for word, with no cultural overlap, no shared community, no possibility of contact. The performance is the same. The rhythm is the same. As if the story itself was dictating the delivery, forcing its host to repeat it with precision. Scholars hesitate to call it evidence, but even they can't ignore the consistency. What makes it worse is the silence that surrounds the stories. Parents deny ever teaching them. Teachers insist they've never heard them. Families argue, some members swearing they recall a bedtime version while others insist it never happened. Online, entire threads collapse into contradiction, hundreds of people describing the same memory in detail, while another group insists it never existed at all. This isn't just unreliable memory. It's fragmentation. Narrative gaslighting that leaves the listener uncertain not only about the story, but about their own past. In the last decade, psychologists studying contagious memory have warned how false recollections can spread socially, implanted through repetition until they feel authentic. But the wishdom stories don't need suggestion. They arrive already lodged in the mind, skipping the stage of invention altogether. You don't remember hearing them for the first time. You simply realize one day that you've known them all along. That they've been waiting. And here lies the seed of paranoia. If a memory has no origin, no first point of contact, did you ever really choose to believe it? If a story can live inside you without permission, what else can be planted there? What if folklore isn't just a cultural artifact, but a delivery system? A program written in rhyme, wrapped in myth, disguised as nostalgia? When you find yourself repeating the words without remembering who gave them to you, you have to ask the question, whose memory are you carrying? And how long has it been there, waiting, unseen, inside you? You search for the stories, hoping to confirm your memory, hoping that somewhere in the labyrinth of old servers and archives you'll find a scrap of evidence to prove you didn't imagine it. But the deeper you go, the more the trail collapses beneath your hands. Newspaper clippings appear as broken images, half-scanned, headlines preserved but body text corrupted into static. Archive.org returns snapshots of vanished sites, ghost pages that once carried the phrase, Whishdom cycle, before the record flatlines into error messages. One researcher posts screenshots of the missing pages, but when you refresh the thread the images are gone, replaced with gray placeholders, the captions intact but the content erased. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Each anomaly feels less like decay and more like removal. Even official records offer no clarity. Through FOIA requests, fragments of documents surface from obscure government studies on oral folklore traditions. But they arrive smothered in black ink, entire paragraphs redacted until only single words remain, isolated and taunting. Tradition. Oral. Memory. These reports hint at larger projects, studies that may have catalogued anomalies like wishdom stories decades before the internet gave them new breath. But the evidence has been silenced. The few surviving lines are skeletal, stripped of meaning, as though the most dangerous part of the research wasn't the conclusions but the fact that it ever existed at all. Speculation grows in the shadows left behind. Was this academic suppression? A bureaucratic purge of outdated folklore studies? Or something more deliberate, an effort to erase the origins of what some researchers describe as folk warnings? The uncomfortable question emerges. Who benefits from erasing stories that appear without origin? Why redact bedtime tales, campfire rhymes, nursery parables? Unless those stories were never harmless to begin with. Unless they carried something embedded, something designed to slip through generations unnoticed. At first, the missing records feel like coincidence, the kind of accidental digital erosion that erases millions of pages every year. But as the repetition builds, page after page, archive after archive, the weight shifts. Coincidence begins to feel like strategy. Too many dead links, too many corrupted clippings, too many black bars where answers should be. It starts to feel like someone doesn't want you to follow the trail, like the story itself is being erased in real time, pulled out of the ground the moment you start digging. And then, in the middle of the silence, the timelines begin to crack. Mentions appear in clusters: 1973, 1989, 2006, 2021. Each separated by years, each told in the same words, with no surviving context. Missing decades stretch between them, years of silence as though the stories were deliberately withheld until the pattern could repeat again. The gaps are almost as important as the appearances. What vanished in between? What was prevented from surfacing? And more importantly, who decides when the story is allowed to return? It spreads the way a sickness does, unseen, silent, but impossible to ignore once it has taken hold. You don't just hear a Whishdom story. You carry it. The words take root like a parasite, settling into the folds of memory until they no longer feel foreign. Days later, you find yourself repeating them without intention, reciting phrases you never meant to remember. The story waits inside you like an unfinished sentence, demanding to be told again, passed forward. And with each retelling, something shifts. The words bend, subtly, pulling closer to an invisible center, shaping themselves into something that feels less like fiction and more like instruction. Psychologists have long warned about the fragility of memory. Experiments show how false stories can be implanted with nothing more than repetition, how suggestion reshapes the past until what never happened feels undeniable. But Whishdom stories don't just rewrite memory, they travel through it. They hijack it. Repetition doesn't dilute them, it sharpens them. And the more voices they pass through, the more uniform they become, as though the act of transmission is not corrupting the story, but perfecting it. Some theorists call them mimetic hazards, dangerous knowledge encoded inside stories, designed to bypass skepticism and lodge themselves directly into the psyche. The structure is the weapon, the rhythm of the phrases, the unfinished endings, the way each tale breaks just before resolution, forcing the listener to step in, to create closure, to complete the design. In finishing the story, you become part of it. You don't just repeat the words, you perform the programming written into them. Patterns confirm the mechanism. Identical phrases surface across communities that share no contact. Forums in Russia and Brazil, classrooms in rural Canada, transcripts of psychiatric interviews in Japan. The language remains untouched, the cadence preserved, as though the story is enforcing its own survival. Variations appear only in what's left out, endings that vanish, morals that dissolve into silence, conclusions that refuse to exist. Each time, the story arrives whole, but exits incomplete, as if demanding that the next listener surrender a piece of themselves to finish it. Online, the confessions grow more disturbing. Families describe dreaming of the same place, a town with streets no one has ever visited, a house with rooms no one has lived in, yet each member insists they have seen it, walked it, felt it. Strangers across the world sketch identical landscapes from memory, claiming they were led there by a bedtime story told years apart. The details match too closely for chance, too perfectly for invention. If dreams are private, why are they identical? If stories are harmless, why do they lead to the same unvisited place? This is how the transmission works. A story enters unfinished, forces itself open, and leaves behind a demand to be carried further. Every time you repeat it, you're not just keeping it alive, you're obeying it. And each time it passes through another mind, It grows sharper, clearer, as though pulling all of us toward the same destination, the same inevitable truth waiting at the end of the telling. Some who carried the stories couldn't let them fade. They held on too tightly, replaying fragments until they began to hear patterns where there shouldn't be any. To them, the tales were never warnings. They were coordinates, maps hidden in plain sight. And once that belief took hold, there was no release. Accounts surface of men and women tracing every variation of a Whishdom story across forums and libraries, convinced that if the pieces were aligned, a larger picture would emerge. But obsession carries its own cost. Those who followed too closely reported nights without sleep, voices repeating the same unfinished lines in their dreams, shadows moving at the corner of their vision, hallucinations that mirrored the very stories they were studying. What should have ended in a bedtime whisper refused to end at all. It lingered, bleeding into their lives, changing the way they saw the world. On conspiracy boards, long threads detail users who swore the stories were not fiction but coded accounts of a concealed event, something erased from history but preserved through story fragments. They spoke of buried towns, rooms that no longer exist, warnings wrapped in rhyme. Their conviction was infectious, dragging entire communities into decoding games that never reached resolution. Some claimed progress, but the deeper they went, the more their words collapsed into incoherence, like the story itself had begun rewriting them. Psychological breakdowns trace back to this kind of obsession. Case studies describe researchers of folklore who lost themselves entirely, compulsive behaviors, paranoid rituals, hallucinations that overlapped across subjects who had never met. They saw the same figures in doorways, heard the same phrases whispered through walls, described the same landscapes in dreams. It was never one person's madness. It was a collective unraveling. Even families fractured under the weight of the stories. Siblings argued over contradictory memories of the same tale, each swearing theirs was correct, each memory carrying details the others could not accept. Parents and children stopped speaking, convinced the other was hiding the truth. The fracture lines spread from a single story until entire households came apart. Memory should unite, but Whishdom stories divided, demanding allegiance to one version of reality over another. And then there are the witnesses who vanished. Shadowy Reddit accounts posted sprawling, Whishdom transcripts, collections of stories allegedly compiled from decades of recordings. They surfaced in the middle of the night, always anonymous, always detailed, only to disappear within days. Not deleted, erased. Usernames stripped, comment histories scrubbed, entire posts gone as if they had never existed. But traces remained in the form of replies from those who read them, panicked responses insisting the transcripts were real, too real, and that something inside the stories was watching the people who shared them. In the end, obsession transforms the tale itself. What begins as a story becomes a ritual. Each repetition is no longer performance but invocation, an act that doesn't just carry the memory but summons what waits inside it. For those who couldn't let go, the price was clear. The story didn't just tell them something. It consumed them, line by line, until there was nothing left but the telling. What lingers isn't the story itself, it's the silence that follows. The words end, but they do not conclude. They leave behind a hollow space, like a door half open in the back of your mind, daring you to cross its threshold. Hours later, you catch yourself repeating fragments, unfinished lines circling like vultures around a memory that refuses to die. The silence is not empty. It is waiting. And the longer it waits, the more you feel the story moving through you, unfinished, unfinished, unfinished. Neuroscientists call it the Zeigarnik effect. The human mind cannot let go of what is incomplete. An unfinished song loops forever. An interrupted task burns brighter in memory than one resolved. Whishdom stories exploit this flaw. Every version ends mid-thought, a phrase broken, a resolution withheld. And in that fracture, the brain becomes a prison for the tale itself, holding it tighter, refusing to release it. What looks like accident may be design. A mechanism not of folklore, but of programming. Speculation circles in hidden forums, that the stories were engineered to be incomplete, designed to embed themselves not in books or voices, but in the neural pathways of those who carry them. Like code without an endpoint, they run endlessly, demanding closure where none exists. You don't recall them by choice, you recall them because you must. Memory becomes the story's host, and silence becomes its weapon. The patterns are undeniable. Every documented Whishdom story ends the same way, not with conclusion, but with absence. A sentence cut off. A rhyme abandoned. A final word withheld. Readers beg for completion, but none exists. It is the void itself that keeps the story alive. And as each version circulates, the silence deepens, the missing piece grows heavier, pulling the mind further into obsession. And so the ultimate paranoia emerges. What if these aren't stories at all? What if they were never warnings, never myths, never echoes of forgotten culture? What if they are signals, programming seeded into memory, spreading invisibly from voice to voice, perfecting themselves through incompletion? Every silence after the telling is not absence but command. Every unfinished line is not a flaw but an invitation. And once you've heard one, truly heard it, you will never stop waiting for it to finish. Because maybe the story isn't over. Maybe it's only waiting for you to carry it forward, to complete it in ways you don't yet understand. And in that silence, in that unfinished breath, you realize the truth. The story was never the danger. The silence was.